Thank you very much indeed, Perik. I'm really honored and delighted to be here and to be associated with Dreem and all of its exciting endeavors. So my interests are in how sleep and circadian rhythms are generated and how they're regulated, particularly by light. What happens when these systems fall apart across a range of different diseases? Then using this information to develop therapeutic interventions to try and stabilize sleep-wake across the health spectrum, and then finally to disseminate this information to the broadest groups, whether they be clinicians or indeed patients. So what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes is to talk about essentially three subjects: the biology of sleep. And understanding the biology of sleep gives us great insight in how sleep disruption occurs and why sleep disruption is so very prevalent across the population. And then talk about one specific case about mental illness and its association with sleep disruption. Essentially every mental illness, from depression to schizophrenia, is associated with disrupted sleep-wake timing. So let's kick off with the biology of sleep. And the first point I want to make is to emphasize how much of our lives are spent asleep. So this is a pie chart, and we see that across the 24-hour day, work and work-related activities occupies 37%, and this would include our commute to and from work. Then leisure and sport, about 10%. Household activities, 4%. Eating and drinking, this may be different in France, 4.2%. Caring for others, 5%. Other stuff, but look at this, 32 to 36% of our entire lives are spent asleep. And this alone tells us that sleep is important at some level. And I want to emphasize further how much time we spend asleep. So, anybody here, I can't really see, celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary? No? Well, actually, you all look fairly young from back here. But when you do, it's worth bearing in mind, of those 60 years which you've spent with your partner, 21 and a half of those years you'll have spent asleep. And so it's worth considering when you cut the cake whether you can really put 60 years on the top of it. Perhaps it would be more accurate to put 38 and a half years loved. But the point is, of course, that those 21 and a half years asleep will define, to a large extent, the interactions that you'll have for those 38 and a half years with your partner. Although sleep clearly dominates our lives, it's not been taken particularly seriously. And in fact, modern attitudes towards sleep are very much characterized by this extraordinary individual, Thomas Edison. He didn't invent the light bulb, he commercialized it, and really with this development, we invaded the night as a species for the first time, cheaply and efficiently. And in the process of invading the night, sleep was the first victim. But Edison's attitudes towards sleep, as illustrated here, sleep is a criminal waste of time and a heritage from our cave days, still dominates the way we as a society think about sleep. And in my brief presentation, I'd just like to persuade you that that is nonsense. First of all, I'd like to consider what critical processes occur within the sleeping brain. And three issues I want to draw your attention to, first of all, are developing memories. So much of our ability to lay down memories is dependent upon a good night of sleep. Some of the way we process information, particularly emotional processing, is dependent upon sleep state. And indeed, the ability to come up with novel solutions to complex problems is also influenced profoundly by our sleep state. And I just want to illustrate a couple of those points. So information processing. This is a really lovely set of data developed from Jan Born's lab. And what he had on this axis is the percentage of a group of groups solving a particular problem. This particular group was introduced to the problem in the morning, and they then were asked to solve the problem in the afternoon. And you see that about 20% of the group found could solve the problem. The next group were introduced to the task in the morning and then asked to perform the task the following day, but they were deprived of sleep all night. And you see that about 20% could solve the problem. The third group was introduced to the task in the morning, performed the following morning, but they slept normally. And more than 60% could solve the problem, illustrating, I think, very beautifully that sleep promotes the ability to come up with novel solutions to complex problems. Hugely important. Another illustration of the importance of sleep is sleep memory and emotion. And we're comparing two groups here. Those individuals who slept normally in the green and those who were deprived of sleep for one night. So they hadn't slept for 36 hours. And they were then asked to remember words with a different sort of emotional content. So positive words, happiness, love, joy, versus negative words, war, hate, crime, versus neutral words, such as the word cotton and certain articles of clothing. Apparently they're neutral words. So if we look at their ability to remember all of the words, we see that after sleep deprivation, there's a big drop in the ability to remember words of whatever type. Then if we divide that up into the various salient states, you see that there's a drop in the ability to remember neutral words, but it's not significant. Negative words, there's no significant drop in the ability to remember negative words, but the extraordinary result is that the massive drop in the ability to remember positive words. So if you are sleep deprived, you have a negative view of the world. In addition to these really important behavioral abilities, the brain is also regulating the removal of waste products, such as beta amyloid, which has been associated with the buildup of dementia and Alzheimer's, and that happens partly whilst we're asleep. The regulation of growth and repair across the body, replacing energy reserves, and the rebuilding of metabolic pathways. So huge amounts, essentially much of our ability to function during the wake state is dependent upon biology that is going on within the brain during the sleep state. And perhaps no great surprise, in view of the important things that are going on and the time we spend asleep, then the sleep-wake regulation involves all of the key neurotransmitter systems and multiple brain structures. So in the hindbrain, the midbrain, the hypothalamus, and all of the cortex are all interacting to generate this difference from consciousness to the sleep state. Now, all of this mass of biology and this interaction is being further regulated by other timers. So the first is the biological clock, the circadian clock, which is in turn set to the light-dark cycle and sets the internal clock to the external world. And what the clock is essentially doing is talking to all of that information and saying, now is the appropriate time to be asleep, now is the appropriate time to be awake. There's a further timer, which is perhaps the most intuitive part of sleep, which is called sleep pressure. And essentially, the longer you've been awake, the greater the buildup of sleep pressure and the greater the need for sleep. And under normal circumstances, these two systems interact to regulate all of that. And let me illustrate how that occurs. So here we have wake and sleep, and here's an increase in sleepiness on this axis, and we're going to look at the role of sleep pressure. So from the moment we wake in the morning, the sleep pressure builds and builds and builds, and when we are asleep, it then diminishes. Now, one key issue is that at about now, our sleep pressure is really high, but you don't fall asleep, ideally, because you've got a biological clock saying this is not the appropriate time to be asleep. And what the clock is providing is, in a sense, a wake drive. So we have a drive of wakefulness, which is relatively low when we first got up in the morning, and that's because the sleep drive is low. As the day progresses, the circadian wake drive increases to compensate for that increased sleep pressure. But as we go to sleep, the wake drive diminishes, and then whilst we're asleep, and we fall asleep at this point here, ideally, then during sleep, the wake drive is low. But then as we approach morning and wake up, the clock kicks in, and we wake up at this point. And the key point is that these two systems are normally beautifully aligned. But of course, as a result of societal pressures, if you have jet lag, if you are a shift worker, these provide very confusing and mixed messages, and the circadian clock and the sleep pressure are completely misaligned, and so normal sleep-wake is impossible. And it's also really important to emphasize the role of the eye, which is a lot of what we've been doing in Oxford. There are specialized receptors within the eye that detect this light-dark cycle and regulate the clock. But the wrong sort of light, too much light at a particular time of day, or too little light at a particular time of day, can hugely disrupt the circadian clock, which in turn sends inappropriate messages to the sleep systems, and again, the whole system can start to fall apart. So the reason I've talked about all of this is because this, we see here, is immense complexity. And that immense complexity makes sleep highly vulnerable to disruption. So let me now talk about all of those interacting systems and why they make the sleep biology so vulnerable. So if we think about sleep disruption, or sleep and circadian rhythm disruption, occurring across 3 domains. The first would be essentially short-term sleep disruption, the sort of thing that most of us have experienced in our lives. And the consequences of 1 or 2 nights of lack of sleep produce loss of attention, high levels of microsleeps, we'll talk about that in a second, the failure to process information, increased impulsivity, that tendency to jump the red traffic light, loss of empathy, the failure to pick up signals from others, negative focus, as we've touched on, memory impairment, increased mistakes, and reduced cognition and creativity. These all kick in very rapidly with disrupted sleep. With longer-term sleep disruption, as typified by night shift workers, for example, or people like Emmanuel Meno, who spend most of their time flying around the world, he's vulnerable as a result of using increased stimulants and sedatives, and we'll talk about that. Immune suppression, and this immune suppression may be the basis for the increased levels of infection and cancer risk in long-term night shift workers, increased cardiovascular disease, risk of diabetes 2, and metabolic syndrome. And I'll illustrate those in a moment. And the final domain is that if you're vulnerable to mental illness, then sleep disruption can promote mood instability, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, or indeed can exacerbate some of the symptoms you see in bipolar or schizophrenia. And we'll touch on that right at the end of this presentation. Just some horror statistics. 100,000 crashes every year related to microsleeps on the American freeway. People simply falling asleep at the wheel. This is a very sad example of somebody having a prolonged microsleep. This was the pilot of the 2010 Air India Express. He was landing and fell asleep and then crashed the plane. He was actually in the process of landing and fell asleep. Luckily, this little lad survived. How do we know he had fallen asleep? Because you could hear him snoring in the voice recorder in the cockpit. Tired brains do this. They fuel the waking day with stimulants. Caffeine and nicotine are very effective stimulants, but things like caffeine can last in the body for some considerable time. So then there's a tendency to reverse these stimulants at night with sedatives and alcohol to try and induce sleep. They don't induce sleep, they induce sedation. In fact, many of these are very disruptive for sleep. So, for example, memory consolidation can be hugely affected with excessive alcohol use. This is what we tend to see in adults, but it's worth emphasizing that many of our school children are driving the waking day with caffeinated drinks and tablets, and then reversing at night with antihistamines, such as Phenergan, or stealing parental alcohol. And it's a real issue for teenagers. Appetite can be hugely affected by lack of sleep. So under normal circumstances, ghrelin released from the stomach will promote hunger, promote appetite, and particularly for the consumption of carbohydrates. This is normally checked in balance by the release of leptin from adipose tissue within the gut. This is the satiation hormone. It makes you feel less hungry. And so these two are normally in balance. But what sleep disruption will do is hugely swing the seesaw to an increase in ghrelin and a reduction in leptin, therefore an increase in carbohydrate consumption in particular, which predisposes to weight gain and diabetes 2. And then finally, I'd like to illustrate sleep disruptions' impact upon long-term stress hormone release. Short-term stress hormone release, very valuable, the fight or flight response, but of course sustained disruption of the stress axis leads to a predisposition to diabetes, metabolic problems, heart disease, stroke, stomach ulcers, abnormal digestion, reduced immunity, infection, cancer. One thing we know about high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, is that they'll have a negative impact upon our immune system. Anxiety, mood instability, depression, and indeed impaired memory are all indicative of long-term stress that can be induced by sleep disruption. I just want to finish very briefly with a mention of mental illness, because this is turning out to be a very fascinating set of studies. The majority of psychiatric patients experience clinically significant insomnia. In fact, the statistics that have been published suggest greater than 80% of individuals with significant psychiatric problems have sleep disruption. In our hands, we put it closer to 100%. Kraepelin, back in the 1880s, the father of psychiatry, talked about abnormal patterns of sleep in conditions that we now call schizophrenia, but it was forgotten for 100 years. And indeed, with the introduction of the antipsychotics in the 70s, people assumed it was the antipsychotics that were causing the sleep disruption. Or if it wasn't the antipsychotics, then it was essentially these individuals didn't have a job. And this is what got me into this. It was a conversation with a psychiatrist who said, my patients can't hold down a job, so no wonder they get up late, miss my clinic, and don't have friends. And we thought that was nonsense. And so we then looked at the sleep-wake timing of patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. How bad is sleep and circadian rhythm disruption in schizophrenia? Here's an unemployed individual. We have 48 hours here. This is midnight, and these happen to be the release of a specific hormone, which you see is beautifully aligned. The range of sleep disruption you see in schizophrenia was truly extraordinary, from much of it occurring after midnight to this individual who was just drifting through time, this person who was sort of drifting and then fell apart completely, to this individual here who showed no 24-hour pattern of sleep and rest at all. And this made us think about what could be going on. We then came up with a conceptual framework, which is that sleep disruption and mental illness share overlapping brain circuits and neurotransmitters. Remember I said that the sleep-wake systems involve most of the, in fact, all of the key brain neurotransmitter systems. So no great surprise that if you have an abnormality in one neurotransmitter system that predisposes you to mental illness, it's also going to have an effect upon sleep at some level. So in a sense, we should expect mechanistically to see sleep disruption. But of course, furthermore, the sleep disruption, because of its global effects upon biology and distorts physiology, we would expect sleep disruption by its effects on our biology to perhaps exacerbate mental illness, and indeed mental illness to feed back and further exacerbate sleep disruption. This model has allowed us to identify new mechanisms. So genes that have originally linked to human mental illness, such as schizophrenia, have now been shown in our hands to be involved in normal sleep-wake generation. And indeed, some of the genes involved in sleep and sleep regulation have also been linked to aspects of mental illness. So we're understanding mechanisms. Also, we can use sleep disruption early on as an additional diagnostic feature. So if we examine students at high risk versus low risk of developing bipolar disorder, then we see in the high-risk students, they have no clinical diagnosis of bipolar, but they're at risk of developing it. There's already a sleep abnormality in those young people. So again, we can use it as an additional diagnostic. But the final part, and this is almost I'm finished, is that we can think of sleep as a new therapeutic target. If we can stabilize sleep, even partially, perhaps we'll reduce some of the severity of mental illness. And indeed, in some recent studies, I won't bore you with the details, what we've got here is a study which used an approach to reduce some of the sleep problems in these individuals with insomnia. And in this case, we're looking at their levels of paranoia. These are the controls. So this is the level of paranoia at the beginning of the experiment. They had no intervention, so their sleep remained bad across here, and the levels of paranoia remained. In this group, they had an intervention which reduced the levels of insomnia. And what was exciting is that the reduction in insomnia reduced the levels of paranoia. And we had the same results with hallucinatory experiences. So a partial reduction in insomnia reduces paranoia and hallucinatory experiences. So we can think of the sleep systems as a new therapeutic target. Okay, what I'd hoped to do in the last 50 minutes or so was introduce the biology of sleep. And we see immense complexity here. And this complexity of all these interacting neurotransmitters, different brain structures, the circadian system, the homeostatic drive, the sleep pressure, the appropriate exposure to light, these systems make sleep immensely vulnerable to disruption. And we see that sleep disruption is not merely the inconvenience of feeling tired at the wrong time, but it has global effects, short-term and long-term, on our overall health and well-being. And we finished the discussion with a consideration of this relationship between sleep disruption and mental illness. And perhaps most excitingly of all, we can think of sleep as a new therapeutic target, partially even stabilize sleep-wake patterns, and we can improve the severity of the pathologies that we're seeing in mental illness. Thank you for your attention. Oh.